The Hunting Party was not just Don Medford's most notorious feature film, it was a $1.6 million identity crisis disguised as a Western, British-financed, American-cast, Spanish-shot, Italian-scored, assembled by the producers who had once given Sam Peckinpah his first television job, and released into a marketplace dominated by the man who had just rendered every imitation of his work redundant. We are digging into the wreckage of The Hunting Party with 20 secrets the studio tried to bury, secrets locked inside production histories, trade filings, the biography of a man who arrived on set drunk before 9 in the morning, and the kind of out-of-print career records that only make sense when you understand how many genuinely important people passed through this film without leaving fingerprints. The title The Hunting Party performs a specific act of preemptive honesty that most films about violence in the American West have historically refused to perform. It does not name the hero, it does not name the villain. It names the activity. In the Western's classical vocabulary, the hunting party was a democratic institution, the townspeople, the posse, the righteous community mobilizing against transgression. What the film's title substitutes for that democratic vocabulary is something considerably more precise. A private party of wealthy men on a private train with privately purchased long-range rifles, pursuing a man who has transgressed against their property rather than against society. The title announces, before the first frame, that there will be no sheriff, no law, no institutional structure mediating between capital and violence. There will only be a party, Brant Ruger's party, traveling in comfort, killing from a distance. The film's entire argument about power and its exemptions is contained in those 3 words, and every reviewer who dismissed it as empty-headed failed to notice they had been handed the thesis on the poster. Don Medford arrived at the hunting party carrying the single most watched moment in the history of American scripted television. In August 1967, his 2-part finale of The Fugitive, the episode in which Richard Kimball finally corners the one-armed man who murdered his wife, drew 78 million viewers, a record that held until the Dallas shooting of J.R. Ewing in 1980. Medford had worked under Alfred Hitchcock, directed 5 episodes of The Twilight Zone, earned the nickname Midnight Medford for his innovations in day-for-night shooting, and built a reputation across 30 productions for bringing cinematic tension to what the industry dismissed as mere television. The Hunting Party was his bid to translate that reputation into feature film standing, to demonstrate that the director who had closed The Fugitive could open a new chapter in cinema. Neither The Hunting Party nor The Organization, the Sidney Poitier film he made the same year, moved the needle. Medford returned to television and never made another theatrical feature. The man who had directed the most watched moment in American television history made 2 features in 1971, watched them both fail to register, and spent the remainder of his career directing episodes of Dynasty and Beretta. The opportunity was real. The moment was wrong. And the film that consumed his one serious attempt at cinema was the film that everyone else on the production needed for entirely different reasons. The screenplay of The Hunting Party was developed by producer Lou Morheim, a man whose prior career achievement was acquiring the adaptation rights to Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai in 1954, the decision that eventually produced The Magnificent Seven in 1960, and restructured how Hollywood thought about ensemble action cinema for the following decade. Morheim co-wrote the script with Gilbert Ralston, who had just written Willard, the 1971 killer rat film that became an unlikely hit, and William Norton, whose subsequent credits would run toward the exploitation end of the genre spectrum. The 3-way authorship produced a script that could not decide whether it was a prestige, western, or a grindhouse provocation, and the film eventually made the decision for them by becoming both simultaneously. What Morheim never publicly acknowledged was the structural debt the screenplay owed to Richard Connell's 1924 short story, The Most Dangerous Game, the tale of a Russian aristocrat who hunts human beings on his private island for sport, which had already been filmed twice directly and whose class argument The Hunting Party was transposing wholesale into the language of the Texas cattle economy. Ruger hunts Calder's gang from a private train with custom long-range rifles in precisely the spirit of Connell's Count Zaroff, the man with economic power converting human life into game. That the screenplay never credited this lineage was less an act of originality than an act of omission. The institutional machinery behind The Hunting Party was Levy Gardner Lavin Productions. The Hollywood partnership formed in 1951 by Jules Levy, Arthur Gardner, and Arnold Lavin, after they met in the Army Air Force's first motion picture unit at the Hal Roach Studios in Culver City, working under the command of Captain Ronald Reagan. The 3 men had decided, while filming training materials under a future American president, that they would form their own production company when the war was over. The company they built became the most durable independent production partnership in Hollywood history. The creators of The Rifleman, The Big Valley, the early Sam Peckinpah television work that preceded his feature career, and a string of Western films that ran from modest programmers to legitimate commercial hits. The Hunting Party sat at the violent end of that Western tradition, a product of men who had spent 2 decades building the mythological West for American living rooms, now attempting to demolish that mythology with the most graphic and unsparing Western their budget could produce. The same partnership that had given American families Chuck Connors and Barbara Stanwyck was now presenting Gene Hackman raping his wife in the opening frame. That transition, from The Rifleman to The Hunting Party in 13 years, is the story of what the late 1960s did to the Western genre's relationship with its own violence. The biographical link between The Hunting Party and the film it was most directly imitating is not simply artistic. It is personal, documented, and architecturally precise. Sam Peckinpah wrote and directed the early episodes of The Rifleman, created specifically for Levy Gardner Lavin, before being fired from the show over creative differences. That firing, over Peckinpah's insistence on violent realism, psychological complexity, and refusal to deliver the genre comfort the producers expected, produced the fracture that sent Peckinpah toward his own career trajectory. The man who made The Wild Bunch had been shaped in part by the confrontation with Levy Gardner Lavin over what a Western was permitted to do. The men who fired him subsequently made a film specifically designed to replicate what he had achieved. The irony is not incidental. It is the film's entire genealogical condition. A production company that had helped form Peckinpah by ejecting him, now spending its budget trying to reproduce the aesthetic he had developed in their absence. Before Gene Hackman played Brant Ruger, the casting conversations around the role had circled through the possibilities available for a sexually sadistic, economically omnipotent rancher whose relationship to his wife was that of an owner to a possession. What those conversations were looking for, a man of unambiguous physical authority, whose screen presence could carry the weight of institutional power without requiring the audience's sympathy, was exactly what Hackman had spent a decade being told he was not. He was not a star, he was a supporting actor. He was the kind of man who played complex secondary figures, Buck Barrow in Bonnie and Clyde, the father in I Never Sang for My Father, while the lead roles went to men whose faces fit the genre's requirements more comfortably. The Hunting Party was the production that first understood what his specific quality, the barely suppressed aggression, the surface civility cracking under pressure, the smile that never quite reached the eyes, could do to a film if you placed it at the center rather than the edge. The role of Brant Ruger required an actor who could make the audience believe that cruelty was a form of competence. Hackman delivered it so completely that critics who otherwise dismissed every other element of the film specifically accepted his performance from their contempt. He had found, in the most critically reviled Western of 1971, the register that the French Connection would canonize within months. Oliver Reed arrived on the Spanish locations in 1970 as Britain's most volatile major film star, a man who had just played Bill Sikes in Oliver, who had been within, in the words of biographer Cliff Goodwin, a sliver of being cast as James Bond before his drinking and fighting disqualified him from the refinement the role required, and who had purchased Broom Hall, a 63-bedroom Victorian mansion in Surrey, which he was in the process of using as a venue for legendary displays of excess that would eventually produce their own mythology. He arrived in the Tabernas Desert prepared to play Frank Calder as an American outlaw. What emerged on screen was something that Reed himself, in a remarkable piece of self-diagnosis, described as not quite right. He acknowledged openly that he had not enjoyed affecting an American accent, and that the discomfort showed considerably. The accent Reed produced for Frank Calder sits in a transatlantic no man's land between his natural home county's register and a studied generic American that sounds like neither. The film's most critically consistent complaint, that Reed seemed awkward and out of place, was a complaint about phonetics rather than performance. The man underneath the accent was doing legitimate and psychologically precise work. The accent was doing something else entirely, and the two things coexisted uneasily for 111 minutes. The Tabernas Desert in Andalusia, Spain, where the majority of the Hunting Party's location work was filmed, was by 1970 one of the most photographed landscapes in Western cinema history. Sergio Leone had filmed A Fistful of Dollars for a few dollars more, and the good, the bad, and the ugly, in and around the same terrain. The miniature frontier town of Mini Hollywood had been built there specifically for Leone's films and was still standing. The Spanish landscape that Cecilio Paniagua photographed for The Hunting Party, praised even by the film's harshest critics as genuinely spectacular, with Paniagua's eye for the desert's hallucinatory quality producing images that no Hollywood backlot could replicate, was simultaneously the film's most authentic element and its most borrowed one. The West Texas that audiences were watching was Andalusia. The Andalusia they were watching had already been West Texas, Mexico, and the Confederate South in dozens of films that preceded this one. The landscape Paniagua made beautiful was beautiful in a way that carried the accumulated visual grammar of every other film that had used it, and the critics who found The Hunting Party derivative were, in the most precise possible sense, correct. It was derivative. It was derivative of A Fistful of Dollars, which was derivative of Yojimbo, which was derivative of Dashiell Hammett. The Tabernas Desert was the most honest location the production could have chosen. Riz Ortolani, the Italian composer whose score for Mondo Cane in 1962 had produced the international hit More, and whose subsequent career had encompassed some of the most sophisticated and emotionally complex music in European genre cinema, was hired to score The Hunting Party in a decision whose logic was entirely commercial. The spaghetti western had made Italian composers synonymous with a specific kind of Western musical vocabulary, and the production's attempt to position itself as a spaghetti-adjacent American product made an Italian composer not just appropriate but strategically necessary. Ortolani delivered something that exceeded the assignment. A score built around a repeating electric guitar riff over percussion and sweeping strings, genuinely melancholic, capturing the film's fatalistic atmosphere with a precision that its direction did not always manage. What Ortolani himself remembered most from the experience was not the music. While in Hollywood for the scoring sessions, he gave interviews criticizing the industry-wide trend of low-budget productions using recut library music rather than commissioning original scores, a practice he described as systematically devaluing the craft of film composition. His score for The Hunting Party was never released as a soundtrack album. The only commercial release was the main theme on a United Artists single in 1971, with Where Is Papa as the B-side. The finest element of the film he had come to Hollywood to score was available only as the A-side of a 45, and the man who wrote it spent his visit lecturing the industry on why it did not value what he had produced. He was right. Nobody listened. The Hunting Party was, in the most precise technical sense, a film of no fixed nationality. It was financed by British money through Brighton Pictures. It was produced by Americans, Levy Gardner Lavin, working out of Beverly Hills. It was directed by an American who was employed primarily by American television networks. It was shot in Spain by a Spanish cinematographer using Spanish crews. It was scored by an Italian composer. It starred one British actor, one American actor, and one American actress. Its dialogue was in American English about American events set in American territory. United Artists, the American distributor, released it as an American film. The Spaghetti Western Database, which catalogs films made in the Italian-Spanish production tradition, lists it as falling within its purview. The film that nobody owned in any coherent national sense was the film that nobody claimed in any critical sense, appearing on no country's list of significant westerns from 1971, belonging to no tradition definitively enough to be defended by that tradition's advocates. Its statelessness was its commercial condition. A film made everywhere by everyone was received nowhere by no one. The supporting cast of The Hunting Party functions, in retrospect, as a roll call of the new Hollywood's character-actor tradition at its most concentrated. L.Q. Jones, who had appeared in The Wild Bunch, and who would subsequently become one of the most recognizable faces in American genre cinema, played Hogg Warren, one of The Hunting Party's members, with the loose, dangerous affability he brought to every role that required a man to seem pleasant while being fundamentally threatening. Spradlin, who had made his film debut in Zabriskie Point the previous year, and who would eventually appear in The Godfather Part 2 as a corrupt senator, played Sam Bayard. Mitchell Ryan, who would later be best known for his television work on Dark Shadows, played Doc Harrison. The cumulative weight of these performances, men who understood the genre's conventions well enough to subvert them without announcing the subversion, is one of the film's most under-acknowledged technical achievements. The critics who called The Hunting Party an example of hack work were reviewing the direction. They were not reviewing the ensemble, which was doing something considerably more disciplined than the film's reputation has ever acknowledged. Cecilio Paniagua was among the most accomplished Spanish cinematographers of the spaghetti western era, a man who had photographed dozens of international co-productions in Almeria and whose visual command of the desert landscape was not acquired through aesthetic preference, but through hundreds of days' accumulated experience in that specific terrain. His work on The Hunting Party, which multiple critics singled out as the film's lone, unambiguous success, and which one reviewer writing for the genre journal Fantastica argued deserved an Academy Award nomination had the film been considered respectable enough to nominate, has received no scholarly attention, no retrospective consideration, and no entry in any major English-language reference work on cinematography. The images that the critics who despised the film nonetheless called gorgeous were produced by a craftsman who received the dismissal by association that always accompanies work in disreputable genres. Paniagua photographed the Tabernas Desert as though it were a moral condition rather than a location, making the landscape's indifference to the violence happening across it the film's most consistent visual argument. His contribution was invisible in the way that all great cinematography is invisible, not because it was absent, but because it was so precisely calibrated that the audience absorbed it without registering it as a separate act of creation. What is most precisely documented about the Hunting Party's reception in 1971 is not the critical consensus, which was predictably hostile, but the specific terms of the hostility. Variety's review summarized the critical position with the precision that trade papers occasionally achieve when they are not trying to be kind. Seldom has so much fake blood been splattered for so little reason. Roger Greenspun in the New York Times called it a really stupid movie, citing director Medford for pushing scenes past their dramatic limit into what he described as helpless banality. The production's own publicity materials had made a claim that those reviews systematically demolished. The film shows the men of Texas and the West not as folklore makes them out to be, but as they really were. The aspiration to the stark realism of Stroheim's greed, which the film's opening frames, with their juxtaposed throat-cutting and marital assault, seemed to announce was an aspiration the film's execution could not sustain. The violence that was supposed to be the honest version of the Western's sanitized mythology became, under Medford's direction, the spectacle that replaced the mythology rather than interrogating it. The film wanted to show the West as it was. It showed the West as it bled, which is a different and considerably less interesting proposition. Gene Hackman was in the middle of filming The French Connection, or had just completed it, while The Hunting Party was in post-production and preparing for release. The two films shared a calendar year, a star, and an argument about the nature of institutional authority and its relationship to violence that their respective critical receptions evaluated with striking inconsistency. The French Connection's Popeye Doyle, a racist, physically abusive, institutionally enabled police detective who shoots a man in the back and is never held accountable, was received as a cinematic landmark and awarded the Academy Award for Best Actor. The Hunting Party's Brant Ruger, a wealthy rancher who uses his economic power to conduct a private war against men he considers property violators, was received as a villain in a stupid movie. The critical distance between those two assessments is not a distance of craft. Hackman's performance in both films operates from the same register of barely suppressed institutional violence. The distance is a distance of institutional endorsement. One character wore a badge and the other wore a cattleman's suit, and 1971 drew a very clear line between which form of systematic violence the culture was prepared to celebrate and which it was prepared to condemn. The critical reception of The Hunting Party in July 1971 was a consensus so negative that it effectively removed the film from serious consideration for 50 years. The New York Times called it stupid. Variety called it a bloody exercise in futility. The Monthly Film Bulletin compared Reed's performance unfavorably to the worst excesses of the Brazilian cinema, a comparison so precisely condescending that it functions as a period document of what British film criticism considered beneath its dignity. What all of these reviews shared was the application of the wrong evaluative frame, the expectation that a film positioning itself as a serious revisionist Western, as the production's own publicity materials had done, with their claims about historical authenticity, should deliver the psychological depth and moral architecture that revisionist Westerns were expected to provide in the year that also gave audiences McCabe and Mrs. Miller and The Last Picture Show. Measured against Altman, measured against Bogdanovich, measured against Peckinpah, The Hunting Party was always going to be inadequate. Measured against what it was actually doing, a brutal, class-conscious argument about which citizens the law protects and which citizens it ignores, delivered in the language of maximum visceral impact, it was doing something that the critical vocabulary of 1971 had decided in advance it had no interest in receiving. The half-century that has elapsed since The Hunting Party's dismissal has not produced a rehabilitation in the conventional sense, no major retrospective, no Criterion edition, no critical reappraisal in a publication of record. What it has produced is a slow accumulation of viewers who encountered the film on cable, on VHS, on streaming, and responded to something in it that the 1971 critical apparatus was constitutionally unable to locate. The film's argument that economic power in the American West was never mediated by law, that the man who owned the land also owned the enforcement of his will over it, That the difference between Brant Ruger and Frank Calder was not moral but financial has aged into a description of conditions that subsequent American history has documented with increasing clarity. The violence that critics called gratuitous in 1971 was gratuitous in the same way that institutional power is always gratuitous, disproportionate to any legitimate provocation, self-authorizing, and entirely certain of its own righteousness. A Kino Lorber Blu-ray release in 2017 gave the film its first genuine home video presentation. The audience that found it there was smaller than it deserved and larger than the critical record predicted. The film that Variety said had no reason to exist has been running, quietly, for 50 years. The film that survived, stateless, scoreless, critically buried on the same calendar as the Oscar winner its star was simultaneously making, is ugly. It is also, in its ugliness, more precise about its subject than the polished masterpieces that surrounded it. Don Medford spent his career directing the moments that other people's narratives required, the finale that closed The Fugitive, the episode that resolved the season, the scene that the showrunner's arc demanded, and The Hunting Party was the production where he was finally responsible for the entire architecture himself, with no network to answer to and no audience guarantee to protect. He made a film that 78 million people never saw, directed by the man they had trusted with the most watched moment in television history, about the kind of power that operates most effectively when nobody is watching. The hunting party in the film never stops hunting because there is no institutional force to make it stop. But here is the question that the hunting party leaves embedded in that final image, in those bodies arranged across the Tabernas Desert that the camera surveys without comment or consequence. If the film that most honestly described how economic power authorizes its own violence in the American West was dismissed in 1971 as a stupid movie, while the film that celebrated a police detective conducting that same violence with institutional backing won the Academy Award for Best Picture, then what is the critical consensus of any given year actually measuring? And if the answer is that it is measuring which forms of violence the culture has decided to call legitimate, which films being celebrated right now are performing exactly that function, and which ones are being dismissed for showing you what the celebration is covering up? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see The Hunting Party, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.